Most of us have a box in the attic filled with items we refuse to discard, relics that serve as physical anchors to our past. You might look at a broken coffee maker, a stack of worn-out paperbacks, or a chipped mug and feel they are worth a small fortune. It feels reasonable to demand a high price for these items because they hold a unique history that only you can appreciate. However, ownership creates an artificial value boost known as the endowment effect. This is a deep psychological attachment. Once an object becomes part of your identity, losing it feels like a personal injury. You're not just selling a mug, you are parting with a memory. When you hold on to these items, you are essentially paying a storage tax on your own nostalgia, sacrificing physical and mental space for objects that no longer serve a functional purpose. The consequence of this behavior is significant. By cluttering your environment with the past, you limit your ability to innovate in the present. Every square inch of your home occupied by a relic is space unavailable for a new project. To break this cycle, ask yourself, if I did not own this today, what would I pay to acquire it from a stranger? This resets your perspective, helping you see the item as a depreciating asset rather than a sacred artifact. Once you detach your ego from your possessions, you notice other patterns, such as sitting through a poor movie simply because you paid for the ticket, even when your time would be better spent elsewhere. This is the transition from valuing the object to valuing the utility of your time, a shift essential for personal growth. Perhaps you have poured months or years into a failing project, convinced that quitting means your effort was for nothing. It feels logical to finish to justify the cost. But past investments are gone and are irrelevant to future success. The emotional sting of admitting a waste of time triggers an irrational desire to break even, leading you to throw good time after bad. This is the sunk cost fallacy in action, a cognitive trap that forces us to prioritize the preservation of our past efforts over the optimization of our future outcomes. The mechanism here is a failure to distinguish between sunk costs, which cannot be recovered, and opportunity costs, which represent the potential gains you forfeit by staying the course. The solution is to ignore past inputs and evaluate only future utility. If a project is fundamentally broken, walk away. By clinging to a lost cause, you are not just losing the time you already spent, you are preventing yourself from investing that energy into something that might succeed. This fear of change also keeps us in the same bank, insurance provider, or job for years, as we perceive any shift as a risk to our stability. We often stay with a subpar service provider simply because the process of switching feels like an insurmountable hurdle, even when the long-term financial benefits are clear. This inertia is a thief of your potential. It feels safer to stay put, but your current default is just a past choice, not necessarily the best option for today. Our brains perceive change as a potential loss of stability, triggering risk aversion. The remedy is to treat your status quo as a brand new decision. If I were choosing today, without the weight of my previous commitment, would I pick this? This shift reveals how we are constantly influenced by framing. A medical procedure with a 90% success rate sounds reassuring, while the same procedure described as having a 10% failure rate sounds like a gamble. The facts are identical, but the emotional response differs. When you understand this, you realize that your preferences are often dictated by the person presenting the information rather than the information itself. By recognizing the frame, you can look at the raw data, which is the only way to make an objective, informed choice. Your mind is not a neutral calculator. It is hardwired to react to the difference between gains and losses. When a choice is framed as a gain, we become risk-averse to lock in success. When framed as a loss, we become risk-seeking to avoid the pain of a negative outcome. This explains why we fear small losses more than we value large gains, a phenomenon known as loss aversion. To counter this, rephrase every major decision into both gain and loss terms. If your preference shifts based on wording, you're being influenced by the frame rather than the facts. Losing $100 feels significantly worse than the joy of finding that same amount, a fundamental human trait that often leads to poor financial decision-making. Think of the investor who holds a crashing stock because they cannot bear to realize the loss, even when the company's fundamentals have collapsed. By forcing yourself to look at the same scenario from two different angles, you strip away emotional bias and expose the underlying reality of the choice. This cognitive exercise acts as a circuit breaker, preventing your brain from defaulting to its primitive fear-based responses. Our brains are evolutionarily tuned to prioritize immediate survival over long-term accumulation. The psychological pain of a loss hits the nervous system harder than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Because our ancestors needed to avoid starvation, the sting of losing resources was a stronger signal than the benefit of finding them. Recognize this bias when you feel anxiety over minor financial setbacks. Understanding that your brain is overreacting allows you to stop letting fear dictate your choices. When you are deep in the red, your instinct is to double down on a bad bet, just to get back to even. This is the disposition effect, where we refuse to accept a loss because doing so makes the failure permanent. This feels like grit, but it is a psychological trap. We become irrational gamblers when we enter the loss zone. Because the brain dislikes closing the book on failure, it pushes you toward high-risk, low-probability gambles. You are throwing good money after bad, hoping for a miracle that rarely arrives. The solution is to set strict stop-loss limits before starting any venture. By defining your exit strategy in advance, you remove the emotional burden of the decision when the time comes to cut your losses. This logic also explains why we fear missing out on opportunities. We see the success of others and feel a stinging urgency to jump in. Convinced we are missing a once-in-a-lifetime chance, this fear of missing out is really a fear of a relative loss. We are not worried about the opportunity itself. We are worried that others are getting ahead while we stay put. This happens because our brains are wired for social comparison. We stop measuring progress against our own goals and shift our reference point to the wins of our peers. To break this cycle, ignore external benchmarks and focus on your own long-term strategy. This shift is the only way to avoid chasing ghosts, which brings us to the tendency to sell winning stocks too early while clinging to losers. It feels like a victory to secure a profit, but you are likely sabotaging your portfolio. We are trying to avoid the emotional sting of realizing a loss. When you sell a stock that is down, you admit your original decision was wrong. By holding onto a loser, you keep the hope of recovery alive, shielding yourself from the pain of a permanent mistake. Evaluate every asset based on future potential rather than what you originally paid. This leads to the psychological weight of regret, where we freeze because we are terrified of picking the wrong path. We tell ourselves we are being careful by weighing every option, but this fear of regret is a form of paralysis. We worry about how we will feel if things go south, so we choose inaction. Yet the regret of not acting is almost always heavier than the regret of a failed attempt. Accept that regret is a natural part of life. Instead of obsessing over the outcome, focus on the quality of your decision-making process. Once you stop trying to be perfect, you can start making progress. Perfectionism is often just a mask for the fear of being wrong. And by embracing the possibility of error, you open yourself up to the possibility of growth. We have walked through the traps that keep you stuck in the past and terrified of the future. By identifying the endowment effect, the sunk cost fallacy, and these other mental shortcuts, you possess the tools to override your biological heuristics. You can now spot these biases in real time and choose cold logic over reactive fear. These patterns are not character flaws. They are your brain using outdated survival software. When you feel the sting of a potential loss, pause to reframe the situation. Ask yourself if you're protecting your ego or your future. Once you recognize the trap, its power evaporates. By naming the bias, you take the first step toward reclaiming your agency. You are no longer a passenger to your instincts, you are the driver of your own rational life. Start small. Observe your reactions and watch as your decision-making becomes sharper, clearer, and more aligned with your true objectives. This is not a one-time fix but a lifelong practice of self-awareness that will pay dividends in every area of your existence.